So in the last two episodes of this series on the life and times of John W. Taylor, you have really gotten a masterclass in Mormon history around the times just preceding and post-manifesto. We continue that series today. Now, last time we left off with pretty much the whole upper leadership of the LDS Church being involved in one form or another in post-manifesto plural marriage. Today, Michael Ness and I pick back up in that history. In this episode, we cover how small cracks begin to form in that upper leadership. Next, we dive into a practice that John W. Taylor started that would plant the seeds of modern Mormon fundamentalism. We finish up this part with a conversation that's super illuminating about some history that shows how Heber J. Grant went from ardent supporter of post-manifesto plural marriage to its most active persecutor. That and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. Well, Michael, we're back at it again, man.
Back-to-back podcast champs.
Now, that's right. That's right. Now, for everybody out there listening, if you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2 of this, you need to go back because these are really building on each other. And as I've been thinking about our conversations here, and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not sure there's been quite as deep a dive as what we're doing, not just into John Taylor, but the time period that this happens in. I think we all have kind of a cursory understanding of what's happening, but we don't necessarily understand the nuance behind it, right? The personalities involved, and not just that, but really what especially, and this came out really in the last episode. It's not like the LDS Church just parted ways with plural marriage as soon as that manifesto was issued, right? They're taking evasive actions. They're sending people down to Mexico, up to Canada to start having these performed. They're doing everything they can to ride that razor's edge of keeping enough distance between the LDS Church. And really, I think you coined the phrase with when we did the Musser interview with those proto-fundamentalists, right? And I think, towards the end of last episode, we started to see that razor's edge begin to fall out from under everybody. Things really begin to change now as we go forward, right?
Yeah, they're about to change. Currently, at the time that we're at, the deck is pretty well stacked in the leadership. But remember, even in the 1880s, we saw people in the average church membership basically suing John Taylor, president of the church at the time, suing him for peace. Give us some sort of concession or statement so we don't have to deal with the government, so we can be free and just enjoy normal life. And so the question does become, how converted are the general people in the church? And that will obviously affect leadership eventually, because where do you draw your leadership from?
Right. From that pool of people.
Yep, absolutely. And so you have the older people who are the stalwarts and the diehards. They begin to die, die off, and you got to replace them. In fact, so at this point where we left off in 1900, you have a first presidency of Lorenzo Snow, Joseph F. Smith, and George Q. Cannon. All of them are, to one degree or another, in favor of polygamy, and 11 members in the quorum of the 12. The quorum is not full, but out of those 11, they are either involved or will be involved or have been involved in some way in either encouraging, arranging, or performing or taking wives themselves, performing ceremonies or taking wives for themselves. The next apostle that is added to the quorum of the 12 at this point is Senator Reed Smoot.
Oh, Mr. Smoot.
Yeah, and then on the heels of that, President Snow dies, and George Q. Cannon dies first, and then Lorenzo Snow dies. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But that's
Now,
essentially what starts to happen.
what year did Utah gain statehood again?
1896.
And what year is the Reed Smoot hearings?
1904 to 1907, pretty much.
Okay. So between 1896 and 1904, does Utah have any sitting senators? Do they have any sitting congressmen? I mean, what's happening there? Because you would have thought that once they were admitted in 1896, that this would have come around a lot quicker, right? I mean, this is a good 4-year gap.
Well,
Were
the
there?
difference was there was no member of the Quorum of the 12 going into politics
Okay, I
at
see.
that point. And so the knee-jerk reaction in the United States was, they're just going to stack the state government, with their own church leaders, and it's going to be no separation of church and state.
Which, I mean, I wouldn't say there wouldn't be any separation, but it would have been a lot closer. I mean, it's hard to deny, right? Because
It is.
Brigham Young wanted a theodemocracy, right? And
Sure.
theoretically, that's what Zion is a theodemocracy, right?
And when you had a state that 90% of the population at that point, if not well over 90% of the population, is of a certain religious denomination, the odds are in your representative bodies, you're going to have delegates from that religious denomination,
Yep.
no matter what way you slice it.
Yep. Yep. So when, well, we're probably not there yet. I'll ask that question when we get to the Reed Smoot hearings.
Sure. Yeah, we'll probably touch on that a bit today. So we left off in the beginning of the year 1900. It is now a new century. We had just, however, back at the end of 1899, we had seen Mission President Lewis Kelch Sr. married to a plural wife, by Matthias Cowley, and John W. Taylor ordained a patriarch, John Anthony Wolfe, in Canada. He will later be involved with plural marriages in Canada. And we saw in December of 1889 or 1899, Owen Woodruff, the youngest apostle in the Quorum of the 12, performed a plural sealing in Mexico, which is his first interaction, I believe, with any post-manifesto plural marriages. And he's probably the only monogamist in the Quorum of the 12 at this point. And up till this year, he has only been able to have one child. And so he's pretty anxious to fulfill certain blessings and promises that were made to him in previous years. Franklin D. Richards and Apostle Mariner Merrill and Brigham Young Jr. have all talked to him, telling him that these things are going to come back.
Right.
Anyway, so, and another important name to remember later, in December of 1899, a counselor and a ward bishopric named Rodney C. Badger marries his third wife, and they are sealed by Matthias Cowley. And now, getting into 1900, there was a meeting held on January 9th during one of the Quorum of the Twelve's quarterly meetings, where Mariner Merrill, while speaking of the principle of plural marriage, said it had come to stay in one form or another. Now, this, I don't know the full context for why he said that. I believe I tried to look for that in the minutes I do have access to, but I don't recall finding anything. In any case, what I do have from as an interesting reaction from Apostle John Henry Smith is his reaction to Merrill was, I think we should be secretive and not give ourselves away. So Merrill's saying it's come and it's staying, one form or another. John Henry Smith saying, we got to be careful, we got to be secretive. Now, 2 days later, there was another meeting of the Quorum of the Twelve. And I'm going to read the full account of Owen Woodruff's journal account of that meeting.
Okay.
He writes, we partook of the bread and the wine, emblems of our master's body and blood. After the Lord's Supper, President Lorenzo Snow said, so far as I am concerned, no plural marriages can be entered into anywhere, in Mexico or elsewhere. John Henry Smith made a speech in absolute discouragement of the practice anywhere. President George Q. Cannon moved that we accept President Snow's words as the word of the Lord. It was seconded, and again, without any chance to express our feelings and judgment, we were forced to sustain a motion that some of us were opposed to or be out of harmony with our brethren. I felt forced to sustain this motion, and that is why I did it, knowing if it were not right, the responsibility would not rest on me. I absolutely know that a number of the brethren, among them John W. Taylor, George Teasdale, and Matthias F. Cowley, are entertaining feelings in harmony with my own. I owe my existence to the principle of polygamy, and I have some intense feelings regarding the sustaining of that principle. I am indebted to the principle for my life, and any time my father wants my life to defend that principle and those who practice it in righteousness, God being my helper, it is at his command. President Brigham Young Jr. came to my desk at the close and said, Brother Woodruff, I want to tell you that the time is not far distant when the question of polygamy will be changed and practiced again. I said I will hold you responsible for that, Mark, Brother Young. He answered, you may. And Apostle Mariner Merrill prophesied that the time will never come in the church when polygamous children will not be born. I prayed to God to give me light on this matter, as I feel almost sick about it. I want to and intend to be loyal to my chief. That's in capital letters, so I think he means savior when he says chief. What do you think about what's going on there?
Okay. A lot of the men you just mentioned, I absolutely adore for what they did.
Sure.
This, however, are one of those times where I think we have to use what happened as a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have Lorenzo Snow that puts us forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're seeing here, and this is just my opinion, is some capitulation on the part of Lorenzo Snow, who's president of the church at this time.
Mm-hmm.
There are several men, Owen Woodruff, Abraham. Okay. We'll call him Wilford's boy.
Yeah.
Owen Woodruff has some problem, has some issues with this. He's not digging this. We know that Brigham Young Jr. is not digging this, Mariner Merrill, as well as John W. Taylor. Sometimes sustaining leadership, in my opinion, means you have to hold their arms up, just like what you saw with Moses, right? When his arms were up, they were winning the battle. It is absolutely a true principle that a leader can absolutely grow tired.
Sure.
And sometimes that means having to ask really uncomfortable questions of that leader. And the fact that they all just kind of went, well, it's what he said, I guess we should do it, or at least not raise a fuss about it, is again another mile marker along the way to how we got to where we are now as a people.
It is.
And I've never had a problem with it because I wasn't like I understand where it comes from, and I'm not trying to cast stones. That's not what I'm saying.
Sure.
I wasn't raised in the tradition of Mormonism. I didn't come into Mormonism till I was a young man.
Mhm.
So I never dug the whole, well, I'll follow that guy even if he's wrong thing, right? Never made sense to me. Sometimes you got to dig your heels in, even with people that you like, love, and respect for the sake of principle and truth. And I think what we're seeing here is really the those seeds beginning to germinate and sprout of what happens when you become about a man versus principle and truth. And so this to me is a sad part right here. This capitulation that really kind of bugs me.
It's interesting to me looking at this because I think it's like I'm 90% certain it's a smokescreen. And if it's not, what I think is happening is Lorenzo Snow himself is getting to an age where it's just you're hard to deal with and reason with. And you're like, it's like when the priesthood split in the council happened in the 1950s, with people on both sides saying that Joseph Musser had a dual personality. I could almost see something like that. Like Lorenzo Snow's getting to the age where, um, I mean, he's telling Matthias Cowley literally less than 2 years earlier, I'm not going to interfere with George Q. Cannon's work. And he knows full on what George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith are doing. But then he's saying, on the other hand, I'm telling you, you don't have authority to do this. And so is it mixed signals of someone who's losing their their cognitive ability to a degree, or is it completely a smokescreen because there's a possibility the government's going to come in and seize your meeting records and see what you're discussing in your meetings, and because like we've discussed and like we've seen in the history so far, every single one of those apostles has been in favor of perpetuating plural marriage.
If it's a smokescreen though, um why write all that stuff in your journal about the other apostles talking, right? Because that could get snatched up and arrayed just as easy as any
Oh,
minutes book.
that's true, and I suppose my guess is that young Owen Woodruff there would um, was not as much in the know on some things, but was also more in the know than maybe Lorenzo Snow knew he was at that point, and so he was not brought in by President Snow, but he's been brought in obviously by John W. Taylor, Matthias Cowley, and George Teasdale.
Right.
You know, but the authority and the secrecies become so compartmentalized that it's like you don't always know what your other constituents are doing at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope it was a smokescreen. I really do. But
But
even if it is a smokescreen, you know that those minutes are going to get out, right?
sure.
And if it is a smokescreen, all you've done is create further confusion.
Yep, and that's what happens now. We're over 100 years removed, and LDS Church apologists are going to take that quote without any of the context. They're not going to read you Owen Woodruff's journal account of that meeting of that day, and they're going to read the official minutes and say President Lorenzo Snow said in January 11th, 1900, that no man has the authority to perform plural marriages here in Canada or Mexico or elsewhere,
Mhm.
and they're going to say that was the word of the Lord through the prophet. But we're going to see more going on than just that. In fact, I mean, literally just previous to this, at the end of 1899, there was a woman who was on the underground as a plural wife, and she was discovered as having entered into a plural marriage, and charges were brought against her. And Lorenzo Snow told the local authorities to drop it.
Mm.
You
Okay.
know, and then he told George Reynolds, first presidency secretary, that I admire the grit of any woman who's willing to enter into that principle.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Right. So, okay. So that definitely would lend itself to being a smokescreen. Okay, I could see that, which makes me feel a little bit better,
Sure.
but
But
still,
otherwise, you're right, though. You're right about everything you said. If it was capitulation, you're absolutely right. And this is the thing that young Owen Woodruff does not know fully yet, that was a smoke. Obviously, from his perspective, he did not know that that was a smoke screen.
right, right, and boy, it'd be fascinating to find out if there was like a second book of those minutes, right? Like this is for public consumption. This is for us boys, right? This is the real deal. So, it because even again, if there's one overarching theme that keeps coming back to play here, it's that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Oh, certainly.
And it certainly seems to be this case, right? From the get-go. Wilford, after this conversation, I have no doubts. Wilford's like, okay, we're gonna release this bad boy, but this is just temporary. This is just to get the government off our backs, and as soon as everything mellows out, we're gonna be good. And then that kind of transitions into, well, let's just do it in Mexico and Canada. We're fine there. And now it's like that's not enough. We now have to deny it there as well. And
Yep.
so it's this incremental movement, right, to complete capitulation that we keep seeing over and over and over again. And no one has said, let's put the brakes on this, right? No one's pushed back and said, maybe we just need to dig our heels in on this.
The
And
only person that has is John W. Taylor
right,
so
that's it.
far.
My
In
man.
three different meetings, right? Bringing up his father's revelation and bringing up Wilford Woodruff's 1889 revelation.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And other than that, though, we can see that this thing's starting to tip, right? Like momentum is beginning to take over, and it'll shift
Yep.
it.
Well, there's a obviously all hope is not lost at this point. The next interesting thing that we see happen is the organization of Granite Stake, organized in the Salt Lake Valley by Apostle John W. Taylor under the instruction of President Joseph F. Smith, with Frank Y. Taylor as its president and John M. Cannon, who was a nephew of President George Q. Cannon, as his second counselor. Now, do you remember any of those names?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I'm guessing they're setting up the stake to be a safe haven for polygamists.
Yep, yep. The Forest Dale Ward was in that stake was in the days of Joseph Muster. Later was called Polygamyville. You know,
Okay.
and during Nathaniel Baldwin's radio plant days, he would build a lot of houses in that ward for people who came to work for him who were
Okay.
polygamists.
Okay. So now, and this is interesting, right? Because this to me is kind of like the rebels pushing back a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, we obviously can't do this. Let's start setting up safe havens for individuals who still want to practice the principle.
Right, and where members of I don't even know if they're anticipating at least with the Granite Stake organization, I don't know if they're anticipating it being a protection against the Quorum of the 12 persecuting polygamists, because at this point, the deck is stacked, like we've said. But we see in the days of Joseph Musser from that last podcast that when it came down to that day, it was because of Frank Y. Taylor and John M. Cannon in that stake organization that he was able to kind of say, hey, I'm in harmony with my leaders and you don't have any authority to come and censor me. Go talk to the president of the church and they can send you in to deal with my leaders and then me if you want to. But I'm in harmony with my leaders and I will endeavor to remain so, is what he told
Right.
them.
Where were the geographical boundaries of the Granite Stake exactly? Do you have any indication where that is?
Like Sugar House in Salt Lake, I believe, around that area.
Well, that's kind of sad. I mean, there's more rainbow flags hanging in that area now than wow. Wow, that took a turn for the ugly really quick.
Yeah, it generally does. But cities of that size are not good, and it was Salt Lake was not that big back then.
No, no. All right. So they start they have this meeting, and then what happens after that?
After Owen Woodruff's account of that
Yep.
meeting,
Yep.
well, let's get into some more of that history. So yeah, that same month, Granite State gets organized. We know at this point that um, at least, yeah, I'm pretty sure at this point Frank Y. Taylor at least knows about the 1886 revelation. I believe he has at least two wives at this point. I might be wrong about that. He's about to get more. Don't worry. And same with John M. Cannon. Um, Pretty soon after that, sometime during this year, John W. Taylor and other authorities on their trips to Mexico, yeah, down towards Mexico and all that, they passed through Mesa, Arizona, and they urged Benjamin F. LeBaron, ancestor of the Church of the Firstborn LeBarons, to move down to Mexico to live plural marriage. Um, According to traditions told in that family, Benjamin F. LeBaron is Dare LeBaron's father, and his parents began courting a woman in Mesa, and they all agreed to relocate to Mexico to go through with it. According to the family, that's around the time that Benjamin F. Johnson started teaching Dare LeBaron was when John W. Taylor was showing up around, which that's interesting. But in any case, May 17th, 1900, Apostle George Teasdale marries his sixth wife, probably in Mexico. He's married a few of them at this point, post manifesto, by the way. I don't recall exactly how many at this point. June 1900. This one's cool. This is a fun John W. Taylor story. So, being one of the resident apostles in Canada, he's not only in church leadership, and I think it's a stake at this point. And so, I mean, he's there, but it's also not, he's not like acting as stake president or anything, but he is. A lot of his business and income at this point is coming off of land investment and other projects. In fact, and he's also tied into church projects, leading those. So he's got his own personal land improvement projects for his own personal finances, and he's taking control of church business stuff as well, right? And then you have a bunch of church members working on a church project. There was a 90-mile canal system that they were digging.
Holy cow.
Under contract. Yeah. And it's June, and they're getting torrential rain for like 2 weeks straight. And it's just mud and slosh. And they're under this contract to do this, but it's now getting really late in like your spring to be planting whatever you need to plant or for harvest, right? Mm-hmm. And the members of the church are about up in arms because you have this church project that John W. Taylor's kind of pushing them for to get done. And like, we're going to starve during winter, right. if in Canada, if we don't get this done. And when they were just about up in arms, he told them and prophesied that the frosts will hold off if they work diligently to finish that canal. I don't know when they finished it, but it was late. And just as John W. Taylor prophesied, if they were faithful and if they finished that project, they were harvesting their crop as late as January of the new year because the frost hadn't come yet.
Really? In Canada?
In Canada. And Charles Oricard writes in his journal, "I acknowledge the hand of God in preserving our crops so far, which is in accord to the promise of Apostle John W. Taylor."
Dude, can you imagine being so confident in knowing, oh, this is a revelation, just not my hopefulness, to be like, don't sweat it. Just keep building the canal. You're not going to starve. And they're like, well, how do you know that? Well, because the frost won't come. Right. And oh,
Yeah, you're thinking you're a madman. If I was a member of the church, right, or just some guys like, yeah, of course you would say that. Your neck's on the line if we don't build this canal, right? You know that's what they're thinking.
right. Right. The pardon the expression, just the balls that guy's got to be like, no, 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 it's all good. Don't worry. Those frosts will be held off. We're fine. Just keep digging that canal. We'll get there. And then
Yeah.
and then to have it be right. I mean,
Well, it's crazy.
it is crazy. It is, but awesome.
Yeah. Oh man. All right. Next on the list. Do you remember Phoebe Woolley?
Yes.
You do. Okay. Yeah. So she is John W. Taylor's sister-in-law because she's the wife. She's the sister of his third wife. In June 27th, 1900, she gets married to David W. Jeffs.
Jeffs.
Yeah. Do you know who that is?
I'm guessing it's a relation of Warren somewhere.
It's his grandfather.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's Warren's grandfather.
It's Warren's grandfather and Rulon Jeffs' father. Yeah.
See, it's so nuts, right? Because we look at like this time period like it was ancient history, right?
Right.
But when you start doing the math, it's really not. Um, I listened to one of Joe Rogan's comedy specials once, and he was talking about the Constitution. He's like, it's not really that long ago. When you think about it, if people are living to like 80, that's like 2.5 people ago, right? And that's really what we're seeing here, right? When we start making these connections, like this is just a couple generations back, it's
Mhm.
like, holy crap, that's not that long ago, right?
No.
And it's nuts.
No, it is absolutely nuts. So David W. Jeffs served in the same mission at the same time with Joseph Musser, and they were friends
Mm-hmm.
in the 1890s. So he's fresh off his mission for the church, gets married to Phoebe Woolley, daughter of Samuel Woolley, niece of John W. Woolley. Um, that makes him brother-in-law of John W. Taylor. And that affords him special privileges,
Oh yeah.
which will eventually be the catalyst for him, joining the priesthood work. After the days of Lauren Woolley, after the group comes to the forefront, he ends up getting Joseph Musser ends up giving him an edition of Truth magazine
Okay.
later on, and brings him in. And in 1943 or so, if I'm remembering my dates correctly, Joseph Musser ordains him one of the group's first patriarchs.
Really?
David W. Jeffs, to give patriarchal blessings. Him and Fred Morrison, um, who's one of Sean Anderson's uncles, of some distant relation, by the way.
Shout out to
And
Sean Anderson.
yeah, and also, I believe he was found to have the gift of healing, and was called upon to exercise a lot of healing blessings in those days.
And I think this is a good spot too to talk about. This to me is one of those stories where you can see things that start off really good with David
Sure.
Jeffs and
Yep.
how quickly it can go off the rails, how quickly it can go dark if you're not careful.
Yeah, it went very dark. And yeah, to acknowledge what happens with Rulon Jeffs and Warren Jeffs, yeah, in no way, shape, or form of me mentioning David W. Jeffs am I endorsing anything that Rulon or Warren ended up doing that were bad. There's some interesting history with Rulon Jeffs that part of me wonders how accountable he was in his later years. I don't know if you and Jacob Vadreen or others talked about this, on one of your podcasts, or he did somewhere. But when Ervil LeBaron was doing his threats, um, he put one out on Fred Collier. He put one out on Ross LeBaron, as well as his brother Verlin, and he obviously had Joel killed. But on the same day that Verlin was killed, there was an auto accident in Salt Lake City. So Verlin was killed in Mexico City, and Rulon Jeffs crashed his car in Salt Lake City the same day.
Oh,
And what they would do, the mafia working under Ervil LeBaron, is that they would go in and mess with your steering column to the point where when you start driving, you don't really realize anything's going wrong, but it will gradually come loose and you'll lose control of your steering and you won't be able to steer. In any case, he suffered severe head trauma and possible mental trauma as a result of that. And part of me wonders if the environment that was created was a result of partially a result of that, in addition to the one man ideology created what happened with Warren. And obviously, as you and I have talked about, the LDS Church pushing polygamy so far underground, that all was that was all bad news. But in any case, nothing I've ever seen to indicate David W. Jeffs was questionable in any way, stretch or imagination. In fact, when the priesthood split was happening in the 50s, Joseph Musser extended an invitation for David W. Jeffs to get a second anointing and be ordained to the apostleship in the new council.
gotcha.
So he wanted David W. Jeffs to be on the new priesthood council when there was that split. And obviously David W. Jeffs did not take him up on that. It would have put him against his son who was on the council
Right.
at that point.
Right.
In any case, that's some interesting history about him. We're going to get into some other stuff about him because he's really young and he's now a brother-in-law to John W. Taylor. In his journal, he writes, in David W. Jeffs' journal, he writes, on June 27th, 1900, Phoebe Woolley and I were married in the Salt Lake Temple. We were sealed by John R. Winder. That's a future member of the First Presidency. He's not a member of the First Presidency yet, but he will be a future member of the First Presidency.
Winder?
And witness, what?
Last name was Winder?
Yeah.
Any relationship to the Winders down in
Probably.
Interesting.
More than likely, Colton Winder and them. Yeah.
Yep.
More than likely.
Interesting.
We were sealed by John R. Winder and witnessed by George Romney and John W. Woolley. There were present William Y. Jeffs, my father, Minerva Knowlton, President Lorenzo Snow's daughter. She was there for some reason. Leroy C. Snow, that's son of President Snow, and a lady that he had married the same day. Our wedding reception was held at the home of Phoebe's father in Grantsville, Utah, so forth and so on.
Okay. Grantsville keeps coming up too. That seems to be a hotbed of activity.
Well, that's where Samuel Woolley lives, and that's where the first three of John W. Taylor's wives came from.
That was a targeted environment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the middle of nowhere now. I don't know what the heck happened.
Yeah, you got to drive a ways before you're in Grantsville now.
Yeah. In any case, we'll put a pin on him for a bit. We'll come back to David W. Jeffs. July. So when was that? That was June. Now the next month, in July 18th, Matthias Cowley performs a marriage sealing for Hugh J. Cannon, which is a son of George Hugh Cannon, and John M. Cannon, who is a nephew of President George Hugh Cannon. So now John M. Cannon, counselor to Frank Y. Taylor, has entered into post-manifesto polygamy, and so has Hugh J. Cannon, and this is under the direction of George Q. Cannon, by the way. But as we remarked at the beginning of his episode, right, he was like, I totally sustain what President Lorenzo Snow said.
Right.
And says one thing, and it's not, it's do what I do and not what I say in this situation, I guess.
Right.
On August 6th, 1900, stake patriarch Thomas Chamberlain Jr. marries his sixth wife, Mary Elizabeth Woolley, in Salt Lake City by Matthias Cowley. Moving on. In August 7th, 1900, down in Mexico, Joseph F. Smith is hanging out down there with Seymour B. Young. Remember, Seymour B. Young was called to fill the presidency of the 70s in the 1882 revelation. And Joseph F. Smith tells him to perform a marriage for Benjamin Clough Jr. And he also, in addition to telling Seymour B. Young to perform 2 marriages, he also commissions Alexander F. McDonald to perform new plural marriages in Mexico for any Mexican residents who request them. So that's interesting to note
Wow.
because so Patriarch Alexander McDonald was the first person on the scene doing plural marriages in 1890 down in Mexico when he was in the mission presidency under George Teasdale. So him and George Teasdale were working together. But then it's now a stake organization, and Anthony Ivins is stake president, and he started taking care of the marriages. But then Lorenzo Snow had sent a letter down to Mexico for President Ivins to stop doing plural marriages in Mexico for a time. But now you have Joseph F. Smith opening the door through Patriarch McDonald again, opening a back door for that to work.
Dude, dude, like it's the amount of just back and forth on this gives you whiplash. I mean, it's like, don't do it, and then another guy comes down of equal standing and says, no, do it. In fact, I'm gonna let this other guy do this so you have some help. I mean,
Yeah.
nuts. Do we have any good solid idea how many plural marriages were happening in Mexico? I would imagine that maybe the records aren't as pristine as, say, up here in the States. Do we have a good idea of how many plural marriages were happening down there?
I couldn't. If I were to run downstairs and grab a little book that I have that Grant Ivins put out, Grant Ivins, full name Heber Grant Ivins, who was a nephew or first cousin once removed of Heber J. Grant and son of Anthony W. Ivins, who we're talking about, right? He put together a little book called Polygamy in Mexico, and it has excerpts from his father's marriage book of the marriages that he was doing that were approved of the church. And there's quite a bit of them, by the way. I don't know exactly how many there are, but there's 260 something recognized by church authority between the first and second manifesto, which includes Mexico, states, and Canada.
And I'm guessing because, look, they just weren't as good as keeping records as we are today, right? It's not as easy to file that stuff away. Things get lost. So I imagine it's probably even more than that. And the fact that Joseph S. Smith goes down there and calls another guy to be like, go to work, son. There must have been quite a bit happening down in Mexico.
Yeah. Well, dude, and it's not just like it's one guy goes down there and takes one wife. When I was looking at those lists, there's a guy named George Nagel who, after moving down there, he married like 3 or 4 girls, and he's not the only one, over time after living there, making your life there. But it was not just you can take one more plural wife, guys, but then you got to get out of our sight and go down to Mexico. I mean, maybe that's what some of the idea was, or maybe it wasn't even talked about, like how far you can take it. I mean, but it's just literally polygamy in Mexico at this point is going on as if the manifesto never happened, as if the 1880s underground days never happened. You know what I mean? It's just early Utah, pretty much, practically, at that point.
Boy, those guys in Mexico had the best of both worlds. No winter, and you get to have your family. I mean, holy cow.
Yep.
Talk about a fiesta.
So Alexander McDonald is instructed to perform plural marriages for any resident in the colonies. So not visitors, but residents. So I suppose that's a limitation of, regarding what he was directed to do. In any case, back to Seymour B. Young, who was instructed to perform special cases, because I believe Benjamin Clough Jr. was not a resident of Mexico. I believe he was either a mission president or he was involved with BYU, which wasn't BYU at the time. It was Brigham Young Academy. Not entirely sure from my memory, but in any case, I think he was living back up in Utah, but They were going to hook him up while he was down there in Mexico. Um, Seymour B. Young records in his diary, last evening after meeting, I was called to administer and bless Sister Florence Reynolds Clough in connection with her husband. I gave her such a blessing she will never forget, neither will Brother Clough forget. She gave, so that's the end of that entry. She gave birth to their first child less than 10 months later. The next
Wow.
day, yes, the next day at Colonia Dublin, Joseph I. Clausen, whose first wife was childless, asked Counselor Joseph F. Smith to make an exception to the ban on new plural marriages in Mexico, which obviously he wasn't playing by those rules anyway. So, and he had Seymour B. Young take care of Joseph Clausen. And Seymour B. Young records in his journal, during this eve, President Smith asked me if I would like to go with Brother Pratt. That's Juarez state presidency counselor Helaman Pratt, son of Parley P. Pratt, who was also post-manifesto polygamist. He asked me if I would like to go with Brother Pratt and minister to a couple who needed my administration. I went and attended to this duty. There was Joseph Clausen and Celestia Durfee, and then he recorded the words of the sealing ceremony for time and eternity.
Nice. Nice. Dude, hey, yeah, going to Joseph S. Smith going, hey, can you wave that for me? Like, he's not like, look around, bro. Be a little bit self-aware of what's happening around you. You're fine.
Yeah, down there, it looks like they're pretty fine. So this gets interesting too. Right out on the heels of that, in a meeting in the Salt Lake Temple, George Buchanan gets into a little bit of a disagreement with Lorenzo Snow over policy, and basically tells him, President, I ask that I not be excommunicated if I fall in love without your approval, if I have no children and take a woman and have one by her, because he was getting frustrated that he had no young children anymore.
Right.
He had no babies in his household. And he's like, I'm going to take another wife. And I hope you won't excommunicate me if I do that.
That's hilarious.
Let's see. In his own journal, so I got that bit from a book called The Reed Smoot Hearings, by Michael Harold Hollos, Condon Smith Hansen, and some others. But George Buchanan's personal journal account for that day reads, at 11 o'clock, we held our usual meeting in the temple. President Snow was not able to clothe for prayers, right? And wished me to take charge. I offered the opening prayer, and Brother Teasdale was mouthed in the circle. Considerable business was done, and we had a very interesting conversation concerning the principle of plural marriage.
Dude, it would have been so interesting to be a fly on the wall in some of those meetings.
Yeah. From books I've read that haven't sourced things, obviously, that are sourcing outside of that journal and the minutes, apparently they really got into it. And George Buchanan was going to take another wife no matter what at that point. Sad to say, he never did. He doesn't live that long, sadly. On the heels of that, towards the end of the year, November, this is cool. This is really cool. Back in Mexico with Joseph F. Smith, November 1900 in Juarez Stake of Zion. After consultation with Joseph F. Smith for their first visit to the Latter-day Saints in Juarez Stake, Owen Woodruff arrives first, and while there, before Joseph F. Smith arrived, he performed a plural marriage there. And then, while Joseph F. Smith was there, he witnesses a plural marriage done by Patriarch Alexander F. MacDonald that we just mentioned before, which had been authorized by Joseph F. Smith. On November 18th, during that stake conference a few days later, Owen Woodruff, while talking in stake conference, prophesied that polygamous children would always be born in the church until the second coming of Jesus Christ. After making that prophecy, Woodruff turned towards Joseph. There sits the man that can set me right. And President sitting on the stand next to him made zero effort to correct.
Wow.
Now, I will say, um, it's interesting that that prophecy is pretty. I mean, I've heard that in Mormon fundamentalist folklore before about that instance where Owen Woodruff makes that statement, but I didn't realize until I did these studies on this topic that he is basically quoting verbatim what Mariner Merrill said
Right.
almost a year earlier in January of that
So
same year.
so I want to talk about this for a minute
Sure,
because I think about this prophecy that Mariner Merrill makes, Owen Woodruff reiterates, and I would love to know if that's actually the case. Because when he says the church, I don't think that they have any idea that there's a split coming,
sure. Mm-hmm.
right? And so now the question becomes, and this is going to get uncomfortable for some folks here, and I apologize. But now the question becomes this. There is only two ways that that prophecy can be fulfilled.
Sure.
One of two ways. One is, to this day, there are low-key polygamists in the LDS Church, which, look, I did for years. It can be done, right?
Sure.
Now, we never had a kid, right? That would have complicated some things, right? I'm not
Sure.
saying you couldn't get away with it, but that would be awfully tough in today's day and age. Or, and this is the part that's maybe most uncomfortable, did the authority leave the church altogether at a
Sure.
certain point? And the church that we speak of now isn't the organized church that we are talking about back then. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
So first off, little anecdote. There's a book called that I bought last year. It's called the Last Called Mormon Colonization of the Bighorn Basin, Wyoming, something something. It was a pretty long title. In any case, it's about Owen Woodruff taking a colony up to the Bighorn Basin to colonize that area. And the author, I believe, who descends through polygamy, but he's not a really member of the church anymore. He did an anonymous survey of that area by Byron and Lovell and Cody and Cowley, because they named a town after Matthias Cowley there, the town of Cowley. Yeah. They took a survey of, you know, church membership there, and it was anonymous and basically asking is, do some of you still practice polygamy? And there's an all red group branch there too, and so that was also accounted for. But there were the statistics show from the result of that anonymous poll that there were members of the church in Byron and Lovell in that area living
And,
plural.
and what year
So
would this have been?
it was published last year.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know when the survey was done, but it was published last year.
I'd be interested to know the date of that survey.
Yeah, me too.
Hmm. I'll have to get
It was
that.
relatively recent because it acknowledged AUB presence in
Okay.
the
All right.
area.
Yeah. So we're talking
Current
probably no later than the 70s.
could be even more recent, but yeah, exactly. No
That's what I'm
later.
saying. It couldn't be
No.
much later than the 70s.
Right. No, not at all. Um,
Ooh.
yeah, very interesting. But in section 10 of the
Part of
Doctrine
me
and
thinks I
Covenants,
need to edit that part out just so I don't bring undue heat on some brethren.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe, and yeah, you could think about that. And I could even give you the source for that and we could read over that together,
Yeah.
maybe on a phone call or something. But um, there's in section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says that he who will not come unto me, meaning the Lord, and repent and call upon my name, he is not my church. And any more or less than this is evil, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so to an extent, there's a spectrum of accountability. And to the light and knowledge that a person has received, if you are not progressing in light and knowledge by seeking more, um, you're not the church because you're not repenting and you're not coming unto the Lord. And so I believe, for example, I've gotten to a point in my life where I've had things revealed to me that to be a member of the Lord's church, by that definition, I need to enter into higher laws. And so I'm still in the Lord's church, even though I could end up getting legally excommunicated from the corporate church because of my belief system, if
Right.
that stands. So, but under that definition, polygamous children under the church, and having a prophecy that there will never be a time that polygamous children are not born in the church, very is very fitting, and you could really, I mean, church apologists could try to dice that up with semantics, but really, I think the intent is pretty clear
Right.
that the church, the kingdom of God, whatever you want to call it. I know that those things are also technically separate, but they are also used interchangeably. You could have just said the saints among the saints, you
Right.
know, polygamy will never die off, the house of Israel, whatever, whatever you want to call it.
Right. No, no, good stuff. I thought about that quote the last time you brought it up.
Well, also, as we saw with Joseph Muster podcast, and we're going to, we'll touch on it again probably, but, in that prayer meeting that Anthony H. Lund had with Joseph Muster and others,
Mhm.
John M. Cannon being there, he said, confirm, baptize your children, hold on to the records, and confirm them members of the Church of Jesus
Right.
Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's what fundamentalists do: is we confirm our children members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
Yeah.
because we believe that we are still spiritually a part of that organization.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, makes sense. Yep. That's good stuff. I just wanted to get that dissected and
No,
look.
I'm glad you. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So you have Owen Woodruff getting confident. He is endorsed essentially with silence on the part of President Smith in repeating Brother Merrill's prophecy. And then Seymour B. Young stood up in the conference and also endorsed Owen Woodruff's remarks. So he was a fan. Um, so that was November 18th. I got to backtrack. Earlier that month, on November 1st, 1900, Owen Woodruff writes in his diary, went to my temple meeting. President Lorenzo Snow, that he said he did not know how it would be done, but plural marriage will again be returned. I am just sure of it. I went to President Joseph F. Smith with a matter to decide. What do you think he's there to decide with President Smith?
Um, to go from the 3 hour block to the 2 hour block.
Good guess. We'll
I'm
see.
gonna
Let's
take another stab in the dark and say it's probably plural marriage.
probably. 2 days after that, Frank Y. Taylor marries his second wife, and John M. Cannon marries his third wife. Um, Both marriages are performed on the same day by Matthias Cowley in Salt Lake City. Now, so after that meeting, so November 1st, Owen Woodruff's talking to President Snow about polygamy. Then he just says in his journal he's going to go talk to President Smith about polygamy, or about something to decide. Then they go on their trip together to Mexico. They have that or that state conference in November. Fast forward January 6th, 1901. They're back in Salt Lake City. Owen Woodruff writes in his journal, President Joseph F. Smith and John W. Taylor discussed the doctrine that in eternity one man will have but one wife was a doctrine of devils.
Nice.
Basically saying is that there will be no exaltation monogamously.
And this flies in the face of some things that, and again, it happened in increments, right? Um, for a long time, it was said that, polygamy isn't that big of a deal, right? Plural marriage is not that big of a deal. You don't got to worry about it. But to these early brethren, this is some heady stuff that really does have some eternal consequence.
It's a big time thing. I believe at some point we read, yeah, when we were discussing the 1886 revelation in the first episode, I read that little letter from Joseph F. Smith to um, a brother Atwood, I think, that I understand, and I always understood, he says, that you enter into the beginning, or in part, the new and everlasting covenant when you are sealed to a wife, but you do not enter into its fullness until you have to.
Yep.
You are not living. And then also, when you have that first sealing done, you covenant to honor and obey and live all laws, rights, and ordinances
Right.
pertaining to this holy order of matrimony. And so it's contingent for sure, and it's very important. And so in this meeting, you have young Owen Woodruff hearing this conversation between John W. and Joseph F. that there will be no such thing as a monogamous exaltation. It's a doctrine of a devil to teach so. And he's got one wife.
Right. Right. He doesn't necessarily have a dog in that fight, right? If he does, it's the opposite direction.
Yep.
Well,
Um,
and I think this brings up an interesting point too, that like I get calls pretty frequently, emails, and then, I'll go to lunch with people that have questions, that reach out to me through the podcast. And one of them is, do we have to live polygamy in this life to get to the celestial kingdom? And this is, this is my opinion. This is Book of Dave, page 2. So take it with a grain of salt. I've said it like this. Look, does it have to be lived here? I don't think so, but you better be real comfortable with that in the hereafter, right? You better make your peace with that, right? And to such an extent that if the opportunity did present itself, you would do it, right? In this life. Um, if you fight against it and you go to the other side fighting against it, I think that's where you run into problems. Because
I
I
think
I
so too.
I know a lot of guys and a lot of women who want to live plural marriage. They just, it's not as easy as it was in the old days, right? It's a little harder to find
Yeah, for sure.
multiple spouses. So knowing that God is both just and merciful, I I I I would tend to say, look, this is probably one of those things that it's just as important that you get okay with this doctrine, so to speak, that you
Yeah.
wrestle with this. I don't know. Does that sound off base to you at all?
No, I'd say even further, it's hard to find one spouse
Right.
sometimes.
Yeah.
And but in the words of one of my favorite bishops, you do the best you can and you don't worry about it.
Right.
But also, I would add, you better make sure you're doing the best you can, and it
Yeah.
really truly is the best you can.
Right. Right.
Um,
Not like Dave doing cardio best you can, but like actually doing the best you can.
uh, in any case, here's a name that'll pop up. He's relatively important, or I don't know if important is the right word. He pops up a lot in just documents and things. He's a trouble. He ends up being quite a troublemaker, so that makes me like him. His name is Henry S. Tanner. He's a local 70s president wherever he was at. He enters into polygamy with the help of Matthias Cowley in January 6th, 1901. That's the same day, by the of that meeting that Owen Woodruff is hearing that conversation. Um, he ends up being pretty much a pretty vocal proponent of post manifesto polygamy to the end, um, and takes off those like Francis Lyman in the future. In any case, after that, finally, our boy Owen Woodruff, January 18th, which would be what, 12 days after hearing that conversation, that eternal monogamy is a doctrine of the devil. Our boy Owen Woodruff finally marries his second wife, Eliza Avery Clark, married by Matthias F. Cowley.
Nice. At a boy,
Yep,
Owen.
absolutely. And she was in Wyoming. She lived in Wyoming. Her dad was a stake president. Because of that, he ends up entering into the principle after the manifesto. I don't know if I don't know if he was already living plurally or not, but he gets another wife, at least one of them. And he had an interesting conversation with young Owen Woodruff
when he was visiting for quarterly conference or whatever, and he goes and asks stake president to marry his daughter, and has to explain to him, yeah, this is being done still
Nice.
secretly, and but
Well,
he
you can't let your kids one up you, right? You can't let that happen. I mean,
no.
if you're the old man, you're like, oh well, the hell with this. I gotta do better.
Well, he allowed it to happen. God bless him for it, and he was blessed for it for sure. And I don't. If you can find, there was a little booklet published by some college students on Owen Woodruff and his two wives and the letters that they wrote to each other and stuff. It's pretty good. I have it somewhere, but in any case, it was revealed to Owen Woodruff that he was to ask about her when he was speaking in state conference or something along those lines. And I think it was also revealed to her too, but she's just like, whatever, that can't happen.
Right. Well, yeah, you got the manifesto. I mean, there's been all these public statements. I mean,
so she's just dumbfounded when it actually happens, right?
Right.
All right, getting into familiar territory here. On the heels of that, March 13th, 1901, Joseph W. Musser marries Mary Caroline Hill. That marriage is sponsored by, if memory serves me right, President Lorenzo Snow, Rutger Clawson, John Henry Smith, and Matthias Cowley. He had all sorts of help getting that one done.
What do you mean getting it done? You mean
well,
like
if you remember, so he gets a letter delivered. I think it was from Rutger Clawson, but from President Snow saying you've been selected to enter into plural marriage.
Right, and he already had his seconds by this point, so it was
he already had his seconds by this point, and then he gets a year later, or a month later, or something. I think it was a month later. John Henry Smith's knocking on his door saying, "Brother Musser, if you don't do this within a year, your blessings are going to be taken from you."
Ooh, they're coming with some heat.
Yeah, and then later, at some point when he's courting or trying to court his bishop's daughter by hanging out at the bishop's house, and he goes and asks him point blank. Bishop says, "I would if I could. That can't be done anymore." And Joseph Foster tries to explain the situation, right? And then the bishop goes out for a walk, and he finds Matthias Cowley and John Henry Smith walking together on the street and asks him about it.
Dude, those are the ultimate wingman, right? Like, hey, so-and-so is my wingman. Whatever, bro. I got the apostles, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, something tells me they weren't there by accident, right? No. Okay, humorous scene time. This is how you're about to get a sneak peek into how my mind works. I just imagine these two apostles like hanging out by a tree, and they see, Brother Musser walking into the house, and they're like fist bumping, right? Like, there goes our boy, go get it, right? And they're there to assuage any fears that might come up at that point.
Yeah, that or it was completely arranged between the three of them. Look, I'm going to go in there now. I'm going to go ask, and in case it doesn't go too well, I want you guys here as backup.
Right. Yeah, exactly. In case I get run after by a shotgun, you guys got to like jump out and help a brother out, so to speak.
Well, that apparently happened with Brother Musser because he gets sent on a mission on February 2nd the next year because, according to his son, Guy Musser, one of his...
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. We're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full Renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content.
A brother of his second wife threatened to shoot him for marrying her.
Okay.
So Joseph F. Smith's like, okay, if we're going to send you on a mission, get you out of there.
Wow. Wow, that escalated quickly.
Yeah. All right, so that was in March. Going down to April, Matthias Cowley performs the sealing for Mariner W. Merrill, and Brother Merrill is marrying his 8th wife.
Wow, look at Mariner out there swinging the bat. Good for him.
That's what I'm saying. Mission President Joseph E. Robinson marries his second wife, and they are sealed together for time and all eternity by Matthias F. Cowley. Remember that name if he hasn't come up yet already. Joseph E. Robinson. He's our boy, dude. He is our boy. He is our boy, for sure.
What was his name again? Joseph what?
Joseph E. Robertson, I think for E for Edward. Robinson. So he gets his second wife. Folklore, at least in my hero, he's a folklore hero to me. Heber Benyon. Have you ever heard of Heber Benyon?
The name is familiar. I don't know much about him though.
He wrote what is probably what I would consider the first fundamentalist book.
Really?
Two of them actually, right? One came out on the heels of the other one. One was called Answers to Gospel Problems, and the other one was Supplement to Gospel Problems. Basically, where he just lays out things, seeming apparent contradictions in LDS theology or doctrine or practice. And I don't recall if he makes a case for polygamy in those books, but he makes a dang good case for Adam God doctrine in that book.
Really?
Yeah. And they were published in 1920. So well after the point that the Adam God doctrine was getting thrown out the window by the church. Because James E. Talmage wrote his book, Jesus the Christ, in 1915, and the First Presidency released their statement, their First Presidency declaration about Jesus Christ being the Jehovah of the Old Testament in 1910.
Okay. All right. And that was always kind of my understanding by following the timeline of events that, look, I'm not going to say that the book is completely trash, but there's that definitely had a, for sure, secondary mission of get rid of the Adam God doctrine. Let's put this to bed. And they found the most scholarly guy at the time they could, who was Talmage, very learned. And he went to work on it. I mean, he really did.
They could have had Woodsoe do it. I like Woodsoe too. He was pretty intellectual. Or B.H. Roberts could have done it. Not to contradict you, but in any case, you're right. The message was clear that to get Jesus as the focus for some reason. I mean, not that he shouldn't be the focus, but I mean, but at the robbery of the identity of our Father in heaven, the only thing I could ever come back to is that this is a compromise because you feel uncomfortable with other Christians.
Yep. Dude, I say this about 75% of the stuff that we acquiesce on, that we kind of, capitulate on, is due to just wanting. I mean, it is so sad to see that a lot of Mormons do this thing where they're like, no, we're Christians and we'll do anything we have to for you to consider us Christian. And it's gross, right? It's not that long ago. It's not that long ago, just a couple years back, I think, maybe not even that long, where it comes out and they're like, look, this whole thing about, you having, your own children on another planet, that's not really doctrinal, right? And we're still doing it today. I mean, a lot of us still are doing that thing where It's like the kid who so desperately wants to hang out with the cool kids that they will say and do anything,
That's
right?
exactly what it's like.
And I'm just like, stop. Let's not care about that label. Let's just get over that. If you got friends that won't talk to you because you're Mormon, move on. Move on.
Yep. Dude, straight up. I've never needed validation for my testimony
No.
from Jesus Christ from a so-called Christian, and they shouldn't require it of me. Anyways,
No.
it shouldn't matter.
Absolutely.
In any case, Brother Heber Benyon gives a fabulous rhetorical defense for the Adam God doctrine. I'll paraphrase from memory. He essentially says it's astounding to me that Latter-day Saints could ever ascribe to being the gods of anything if Father Adam couldn't be the gods over his own posterity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Because what else are we to be the gods of, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And he goes forward saying Jehovah can be used interchangeably as the son or a son of God. And so that can reconcile the contradiction. Fabulous little excerpt. In any case, April 10th, 1901, he marries his second wife. They're hooked up by Matthias Cowley. April 12th, 1901, President George Q. Cannon dies, sadly. He wasn't super old. According to D. Michael Quinn, he arranged for plural marriages for 3 of his sons and 3 of his nephews before he died, which we saw with Hugh J. Cannon and John M. Cannon and others. He was adamant about maintaining the principle and raising children, even with taking new wives himself after the manifesto. Joseph Musser, as we discussed later, or earlier, Joseph Musser in his later years recalled that the first time he ever heard about the 1886 events was from George Q. Cannon. And that George Q. Cannon was also the source for Matthias Cowley's authority and commissioned to perform new plural marriage sealings for church leaders and other worthy members. As far as we know, the marriages that Matthias Cowley did number 45 plural sealings from 1898 until the second manifesto issued by President Joseph F. Smith, April 6, 1904. Now, I will spoil it. Matthias Cowley does perform more after the second manifesto, but there was 45 between the time he was given that authority from George Q. Cannon to the second manifesto. On the heels of George Q. Cannon dying on April 12th, we're going to circle back to David W. Jeffs now. Okay. Between June and July of 1901, he is invited to attend what he called in his journal patriarchal meetings at the home of John W. Taylor in Farmington, Utah.
Oh, interesting.
Very interesting.
So is this John W. setting up I don't want to say an alternate organization, but maybe an auxiliary to keep plural marriage alive?
I think so. When I'm looking at this, as I've accumulated some evidence, this to me looks like it's like an earlier version, at least of Nathaniel Baldwin's radio plant going on.
Okay.
What we have is for sure testimony meetings being given where family and close friends are being brought in, where they're hearing and relating testimonies regarding the principle and the perpetuation of the principle.
Gotcha.
You have gifts of the Spirit, like speaking in tongues, that are present. It's probably likely that true order of prayer was done for endowed members because members of the Quorum of the 12 and other select leaders were allowed to have their own prayer circles outside of the temple.
Right.
And I don't know for sure. It's not called that in any of the things I've seen, but I highly doubt it's not.
Right.
A circle prayer quorum. And I'm just gonna read some of the information I have on that now. while David W. Jeffs was attending these patriarchal meetings, Patriarch of Davis Stake, Judson Tolman, who is father to Jaron Tolman, who took his fourth wife in the last episode, prophesies to David W. Jeffs that he will enter into the principle of celestial plural marriage. Around this time, so we also have prophecies going on, right? Around this time, Jonathan D. Wood, second counselor in the bishopric of David Jeffs' ward, also prophesied to him that the time would come for him to enter into the principle. In the book Kingdom, not Kingdom or Nothing, Family Kingdom by Samuel Woolley Taylor, he writes that, quote, Father conducted a series of cottage meetings where there were testimonies, patriarchal blessings, speaking in tongues. Nellie, the spiritual wife, that would be John W.'s second wife. Nellie, the spiritual wife, often spoke in tongues, but Mother, that would be his third wife, Janet Nettie Taylor, never felt the urge. Her signs always came in private. At one meeting, a sister spoke in tongues, and a patriarch interpreted, saying that the message that concerned Mother was to do a great work among the Lamanites.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting times. So we have Judson Tolman, who's a patriarch in the Davis Stake. We have David W. Jeffs attending. We have another interesting character. I don't know if he was attending, but I know he was neighbors to John W. Taylor. I don't know if he was at these meetings, but Nathan G. Clark was considered a family friend of the Taylor family. He would later show interest in one of John W. Taylor's daughters, Alta, and got her father's approval to marry Alta, but apparently he could not solicit the approval of Joseph F. Smith at that time to get that marriage done. So he may have been at those meetings.
Do we know why? Do we have any inclination on why Joseph F. Smith said no?
I don't have any indication because literally, according to Rule and Allred in 1970s, he said that in 1909, Nathan Clark was one of three other individuals that Joseph F. Smith gave a special delegation to authorize polygamy, to perform marriages in 1909. And those people were Nathan Clark, Bishop Keene, and Joseph Musser.
Okay.
So a year after he asks Joseph F. Smith to marry John W. Taylor's daughter, he's getting the authority to perform plural sealing. So I don't know the reason why. And then 6 years later, according to other fundamentalist sources, in 1915, John W. Woolley and Joseph F. Smith both ordained Joseph Musser and Nathan Clark and Heber Hale to the Keys of Elijah to make sure that a year didn't go by that children weren't born under the covenant of plural marriage.
Okay. Interesting.
So he was definitely in at some point. If it wasn't now, it was later. But it was definitely in the inner circle to a point. Nathan Clark's sister married another resident of that area named Walter W. Steed, who we covered a little bit in the last episode. Walter and Alice Clark, Nathan's sister, were married by Matthias Cowley. Walter's father, Thomas Steed, was a member of the Davis Stake High Council, just like John W. Woolley was. And Walter W. Steed would later marry one of John W. Taylor's wife's sisters, in addition to Nathan Clark's sister.
Wow.
And his brother, Thomas J. Steed, married another sister of one of John W. Taylor's wives.
Wow. Okay. The Steeds really liked the Taylor family.
Yeah, or the in-laws to the Taylor family. That was Ellen Sandberg was John W. Taylor's sixth wife. She had two sisters who married Steed brothers.
Okay.
And so they may or may not have been in those patriarchal meetings. I don't know. I think it's quite likely that they probably were, based on the way that things turned out there. They had a relationship with the Taylor family in any case. Israel Barlow Jr., was another one of those in Davis County
Okay.
who may have been involved and was involved with Judson Tolman, and he got one of his wives. We'll get down to that particular later. But Israel Barlow and John Y. Barlow and some of his boys were involved with Judson Tolman, and who definitely was at the John W. Taylor meetings. According to Family Kingdom by Samuel Woolley Taylor, John W. Taylor canceled the meetings because he perceived that there was an abuse of the gift of tongues happening. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, look, we know that Joseph certainly, while not opposed, definitely, we have record of speaking in tongues back in that time period during Joseph's time. He also seems to think and believe, and I would agree with him, that it shouldn't look like a Pentecostal meeting, right?
Uh-huh.
The other thing is that the gifts of tongues can be good, right? I don't want to say that it can't. I am a believer in the gift of tongues, but sometimes it can be used for some pretty iffy things, right? And so I think that John W. Taylor is really kind of following Joseph Smith's lead in this, that this isn't something that should be done for self-aggrandizement, right? There should be a clear interpretation of these things. And when it starts to get into the realm of building somebody up or being the mechanism for which you can self-aggrandize yourself, I would think that takes some correction.
I would agree.
I definitely am a believer in the gift of tongues. We see it in the old days of the church. I think it's valid.
Sure.
It's just a matter of what is it that's being communicated there.
Yep. Oh, it's a gift I would seek to have. I don't pretend to fully understand it or why it would be necessary for me to use. I guess, like I said, it would just be to edify someone else. I think it would be exciting, but um, I think with anything that's a gift from God, you definitely just got to treasure it and not treat it lightly and make it. It's like, as we're taught in the church, using the shorthand term for the priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, which is not the name for the for the order of the priesthood, and it's kind of like that, right? Where the idea was, don't cheapen it by overuse.
Right.
In any case, yeah, and revelation, personal revelation is a tricky business too. But that's what we have. Things like that I would consider iron rods for us to hold fast to when there is any doubt or question. All right, so on the heels of these patriarchal meetings, so we know obviously testimonies are going to be given. It's likely, probably even that the stuff like the 1886 revelations being shared. The right after this, John W. Taylor takes two more wives. There's two girls in Farmington, and he says that he went to get permission from the president of the church, who at the time was Lorenzo Snow. Says he got permission. In some other circumstantial evidence that Lorenzo Snow was supporting polygamy, even at this late time. There is an entry in Heber J. Grant's journal where he writes on July of 1901, before he leaves on his mission. Before I went to Japan, my president intimated that I better take the action needed to increase my family. And then on May 26, 1901, he writes, temple fasting meeting, 17 years since Gusta and I married, she willing to have me do my duty, and President Snow. So he got approval from President Snow to take another wife, but it never
It never happened. So looks
Interesting.
like Heber J Grant got approval, though. John W. Taylor got approval. He also went to Joseph F. Smith about it. Obviously, got approval. Matthias Cowley ended up performing the ceremony in John Taylor's home.
Okay.
And they were half sisters.
All right.
They were married on August 29th, 1901. His fourth wife was Eliza Roxy Welling, and his fifth wife was Rhoda Welling. And so remember back in 1893 where John W. Taylor's third wife had a vision of
Yeah.
who the fourth wife would be?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember where she was working or what. In any case, John W. Taylor meets, and he doesn't know because Nettie never told him, I've seen a vision of who your fourth wife's going to be. In any case, they needed a babysitter or something because they were going to take a trip or whatever. And so he went to go find a girl from the ward, then brought her home, and Nettie about fainted when she saw her because it was the girl from her vision.
That must have been a little alarming for old John W.
Yeah. Well, then, she tells him, she doesn't even tell him then, she tells him years later that she had that experience. He said, why didn't you tell me?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's that's funny.
I mean, he said, well, I'm happy that my wives are having their own spiritual confirmations that these principles are true, but I wish you would have told me,
Give a brother a heads up here.
Yeah. After, so yeah, that marriage was sealed by Matthias Cowley. He went to President Smith as well, and the kind of answer that we have recorded, which you've probably heard before, was, in that dialogue, was President Smith saying, as president of the church, I cannot authorize you to marry this plural wife. However, I will not oppose you doing it. But patted him on the shoulder and said, be careful, John.
I can't sanction it, but I can't tell you not to. Let me know how this works out for you.
In any case, super interesting. I don't know how old these girls were, but you got to put yourself in their shoes too, to be blindsided by a, handsome and charismatic apostle, but an apostle in a church that says that you can't enter into polygamy, and now he's asked you to be one of his wives. What do you do about it? Do you just go with it because he's an apostle, a leader in the church, or what?
Dude, what kind of a horrible situation to be in, and not the marriage part, right? But just as part of like, so have you gone rogue, right? Like, are you acting against the president of the church? And it's not like John W. can say necessarily, no. All this is a smokescreen. You don't get it, right? It's got to be a confusing place for these young women, right? It would
Absolutely.
have to be a confusing spot for a man, right? The only thing that is a saving grace here is that John W. Taylor is attending all these meetings, right? So he knows that, hey, no, this is good. We're good. We're fine, right? But his prospective brides don't have the same level of knowledge or comfort there that he does because they're not on the inside working. So
Absolutely.
I could definitely see where that would cause a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, questioning, have you gone rogue? Are you off the reservation, right? Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways someone could take that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, their mothers, because they're half sisters, right? So they come from a family where the principle was lived. And in any case, the fourth wife, Roxy, ends up going to talk to her mom about it. And her mom is basically on her deathbed at this point. And so I took this little excerpt I'll read out of Family Kingdom. When Roxy goes to her mom, she says, Mother, John W. Taylor has asked me to be his wife. Her mother lay watching and said nothing. It's a hard decision, Mother. I made it, Roxy. But during different times, Mother. Yes, things are different now. Well, what should I do? Do you love him? Yes. Do you believe in the principle? Yes. I can't advise you to take this step, Roxy, but if you did, it would make me happy.
Hmm.
And this, Roxy felt, was her mother's dying wish.
Okay.
So that's pretty interesting. Pretty heartfelt. I liked that.
Good on Roxy's mom.
Kudos. Yeah, that she would like that. That would make me happy. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing also to go seek counsel from your parents that have a testimony.
And here's the other thing I want to say. One of the things that people used to try to beat me up with on plural marriage was, well, would you want your daughter to be a plural wife? And I'm like, absolutely. If he's a good man, absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing I'll say is that those who do not like polygamy will latch on to any journal entry, anything they can find to substantiate their point that all these plural marriages were bad, that it was about a guy's gratification, it was about all these things. We never hear about Roxy's mom, right? Who obviously has a good enough experience to be like, sweetheart, nothing would make me happier for you than to enter into this principle.
Yeah, this isn't a dad coaching his son to enter into polygamy.
No.
This is a mom asking if, one, her daughter has a testimony and if she loves him.
Yep.
And saying it would make me happy if you did.
Yeah, absolutely. So Roxy's mom's experience must have been, look, and I've tried to drive this home countless times. Was it like living plural marriage? Well, I'm going to give you all the dirty details right now. It's like being married, but twice. Right?
Yeah.
It is about relationships. Every relationships have their ups and their downs. And if you're committed to this, you work through them, you get past it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just, there's no sordid details, right? It's, I know everyone wants to make it something that it's not, right? Everybody's got like, ooh, how does that work? Well, how's it work? It works just like you're married. That's how it works, except twice.
Or 4 times in the case of John W. Taylor.
Right. And here's the other thing.
Times in the case of Mariner Merrill.
Right. However many times you get to, right? I mean, good on Brother Merrill. I mean, I'm not sure I would swing for those fences, but good on him. But here's the thing I'll say too, is that they glom onto one journal entry, right? What I want to know is, what does the rest of the journal look like? Was it all bad?
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. We also know that if you were a polygamous wife and you were not having a good time in your marriage, Brigham on down was very liberal with like, this is not working for you. Okay, great. You can leave your husband. We'll get a divorce. Right? Now, if you were a dude and you were like, look, man, I got a couple wives and this isn't working out, they would be like, sucks to be you, bro. Stick it out.
Yeah.
And so women had the ability to leave those marriages without much problem. A lot of them stayed in them, right? Were there crappy plural marriages? I'm sure. I'm positive.
Oh, certainly.
Because there's crappy monogamous marriages. Some dudes are just douchebags. I don't know how else to put it, right? I mean, it is what it is. Yeah, I don't know. That's my thought on that. It's just kind of a tender story that I like, where Roxy's mom just says, sweetheart, nothing would make me happier.
I agree with you. On the heels of all that, after John W. gets to, it's 4 and 5, not 3 and 4. So he's up to 5 wives. Later that same month, president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Brigham Young Jr. marries his 7th wife, which was performed by Matthias Cowley. He strikes again. And then September 6th, legend has it that while addressing a congregation, John W. Taylor was hit by a sudden pause in his discourse and, while beginning to look ill, declared that the President of the United States, William McKinley, had just been shot.
Whoa. Really?
Yep. He called it on the day that he died. Yep.
Dude.
September 6th, 1901.
Dude. He's the man.
Yeah, he was in touch with the spirit for sure. Let's see. About that time, John W. Taylor is also publicly preaching in Salt Lake City that women would soon be able to marry polygamously.
John W. was?
Yeah, he's publicly teaching that at this point.
Wait.
Yeah.
So what's John W. seeing that would indicate to him, like, hey, this whole manifesto thing, this is about to go away. We're going to be able to do this again. I would like to know what the backstory is on that.
I would too. I'm just here to cite what got said, but you bring up an interesting question there. It was a ballsy thing to do, right? Because I mean, you never know what reporter from Salt Lake Tribune is going to be in your ward to write down what you say and publish that and then stir the trouble up again.
Right.
But he's feeling pretty hot after marrying his fourth and fifth wife and having these patriarchal meetings.
He's feeling it a little bit.
Yeah. And so he goes out and says that October 3rd, 1901, Joseph Robinson, who is serving as president to the California mission, marries his third wife, but and they're sealed by Matthias Cowley. So he's taken two wives in the span of a year.
Did she come from California?
I don't know. I don't know. And then on the heels of that, Henry Tanner again marries his third wife. So he's also taken another wife within the same year. And then I don't know if Joseph M. Tanner and Henry S. Tanner are related, but December 27th, 1901, General Superintendent of Church Schools, Joseph M. Tanner, marries his fourth wife. They're sealed by Matthias Cowley. All of those were done by Matthias Cowley. Joseph M. Tanner was in charge of, was it BYU? He was a teacher at BYU, I'm pretty sure. And then and Henry Tanner was serving as a judge at that point. January 17th, 1902, into the new year, stake President George C. Parkinson marries his second wife, Fannie Woolley, which was a sister to John Woolley, who Heber J. Grant wanted to marry. So that kind of made him feel unhappy.
To me, I think that's the turning point for Grant.
It is. It is in a big way.
I've read this story before, and to me, Grant doesn't get the woman he wants, and he, from this point forward, becomes a different cat when it comes to plural marriage.
Well, and Matthias Cowley told him it gets exacerbated really badly, actually, because Matthias Cowley told him, "I'll help you get another wife," and then he seals Fannie Woolley to George Parkinson, and then later down the road, when it's brought up in the Quorum of the 12, or in the fellowship meeting for Matthias Cowley, Heber J. Grant brings up to the rest of the Quorum of the 12 present, judging Cowley, that Cowley promised him another wife and then wouldn't help him, and Cowley denied it. And there was no other witnesses, and he made Heber J. Grant look bad in front of all the rest of the people. So from that point in 1911 onwards, Heber J. Grant was definitely pretty much against.
Why did Cowley do him dirty like that?
I don't know.
That would be interesting to know as well, right? What are the interactions? Because Cowley seems, by all accounts, except for this one moment, Cowley seems to be a man of honor. He seems to be a guy who who is willing to do whatever it takes to get stuff done for the Lord. But he seems to kind of renege there with Heber, which makes me think one of two things happened. One is Callie just didn't walk up to his promise, but that doesn't really strike me as something Callie would do.
Uh-huh.
Or you start seeing some character flaws or some questions popping up with Heber
Uh-huh.
about, what's your end goal here, bro, right? Maybe
Sure.
something coming up and Cowley being like, well, in good conscience, I can't really see helping you get another wife in the condition you're in.
I would submit that that's possible. It also could be plainly that Fannie Woolley didn't want to marry Heber J. Grant, and so what are you going to do? You help her marry whoever she is going to want to marry. But also, he was on trial for his fellowship, for his membership. He lost his fellowship, but he was on trial for his membership as well.
Cowley
And
was?
Callie was by that point, and he said he'd rather die than lose his church membership. That's just the way he felt about it. And I could see him just trying, not admitting that that was true to defend himself, because him and John W. Taylor, when they're on trial, they are very willing to admit certain things, and they still did lie to hide other people and other things sometimes. And I don't condemn them for that, because they knew their situation more than we know their situation. But maybe there was something else there that he didn't want to expose. I don't know.
Gotcha.
In any case, early 1902, we remember from the Joseph Musser podcast that Anthony H. Lund holds a special prayer quorum meeting with Joseph Musser and John M. Cannon, George M. Cannon, and James Hendry, and others who had been selected to keep alive the principle of plural marriage, and gave them instructions for staying on the underground, that the church couldn't acknowledge these men's plural wives and their children. But Anthony H. Lund told them, "Brethren, you hold the priesthood and stand at the head of your families. As your children are born, you should give them a father's blessing and a name. When they reach the proper age for baptism, you should baptize them, confirm the members of the church, and confer the Holy Ghost in the usual manner. Be sure and keep the record, and when the church will receive it, hand it in." So we know that John M. Cannon has gotten 2 wives post-manifesto at this point. Joseph Musser's gotten 1. And right after that, so that meeting would have had to have been before February 2nd, or February 2nd, 1902 or earlier, because Joseph Musser leaves on his mission because of a threat on his life on February 2nd. On February 3rd, 1902, James Hendry, who was a counselor in his ward bishopric, who was mentioned in that meeting, marries his second wife, and they're sealed by Matthias Cowley. So Musser is reliable on his recollection, is all I'm saying right there.
Right. Yeah.
Down in Mexico, local 70s President Benjamin F. LeBaron was going to have his sealing done to his second wife, and then she got cold feet and suddenly returned to Arizona, and the ceremony was not performed. Sad to say.
Benjamin F. LeBaron got stood up at the altar.
Got stood up at the altar. Yeah, but he, so the whole family moved down to Mexico. Dayer LeBaron was down there in Mexico. He was 16 at this point, I believe. And they were all pretty hurt over that happening and their father not, being stood up there. Dayer LeBaron lived with Bishop Joseph Bentley, who also had at least 2 wives sealed to him post-manifesto by Matthias Cowley. Staying there with Bishop Bentley allowed him to interact with Joseph F. Smith, John W. Taylor, George Teasdale, Matthias Cowley, Louis Kelch Sr., Margarito Baptista, and Owen Woodruff, who all were stopping through Mexico. Dayer LeBaron had an uncle named Don Moroni LeBaron, who would also take 2 wives post-manifesto.
Things are cracking in Mexico.
things are cracking in Mexico, and he never Don Moroni LeBaron never had problems with the church over the marriages, even though the Salt Lake Tribune exposed him in an article in 1910.
The Tribune. It was a
Yeah.
rag back then.
All right, April 2nd, 1902, Heber Benyon, who we previously mentioned. I also forgot to mention that Heber Benyon was brother-in-laws with Heber J. Grant. Did you know that?
Really? No. So you have
Oh,
a guy who comes out with essentially the first proto-fundamentalist book who's related to the guy who, quite frankly, would put an end to plural marriage once and for all in the church.
yeah. Yeah,
Thanksgiving
and
dinner must have been interesting.
I can only imagine. He marries his third wife. They're sealed by Matthias Cowley, naturally. Um, so he's got two post-manifesto wives at this point. I would have loved to meet Heber Benyon. I can't tell this story super well. It's been a while since I think somewhere in my papers I have some interesting correspondences between him and James E. Talmage as well.
Oh, really?
But when that book got circulated, James E. Talmage had a copy or whatever, and like publicly was telling the ward or state conference, whatever it was, like whoever reads this is or whoever blah blah blah, this is not true and or whatever, and they're just causing trouble and well, Heber Benyon was in the audience during that state conference when James E. Talmage was holding up his book, and he wrote him a pretty funny letter. Which I wish I had it. I wish I could quote it, but if you could ever find that, it's worth the read. It's quite funny.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you like offer to go outside and go to blows? I mean, what?
No, it was just like basically Talmage was like, whoever wrote this must be criminally like insane. You should be locked in an asylum.
Whoa!
And Brother Benyon writes back, I appreciate Brother Talmage covering my sins with a cloak of insanity.
Oh, that's awesome. I was gonna say those are strong words coming from the guy who retconned the Godhead. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, September 24th, 1902, John Y. Barlow marries his second wife. They're not sure who performed the ceremony. December 8th, 1902. So, quick comment on that. So now we're seeing the emergence of the first generation of fundamentalist leaders. They're in their youth, but they're picking up the sword and they're finding ways to enter into the principle. This is the point that we're at in the history.
okay. So
Right
now
there.
so now there begins to become this sense of we need to spread this out to people who would be bold enough to do this outside the church once and for all.
Well, I think that happened in those patriarchal meetings. The likelihood is that John Y. Barlow's father or Judson Tolman probably performed the ceremony because they were there in that locality, right? If not, we know several other apostles at this point are taking that work upon them. But we know John Y. just received his second wife. Joseph Musser had just received his second wife. We're going to see the same year at the end of the year. This is kind of cool. You'll appreciate this. Doesn't have to do with fundamentalist leaders, but on a visit with Hiram Mack Smith, which was son of Joseph F. Smith, traveling with J. Golden Kimball down to Mexico. J. Golden Kimball writes in his diary, polygamous marriages are very frequent and common in this country. One man asked me to propose to a young lady living in Salt Lake. To ask her to have him. I think I shall undertake it.
Nice.
So he's going to hook the brother up.
Yes, he is. Yeah, he is. Once again, the apostles being the wingman.
Yeah. I love Jay Golden. Also found out that he was trying to court someone at this time. So
Really?
he was gonna enter into the principle. Yep. John W. Taylor February 1903 proposes marriage on a trip down to Mexico to Anthony Ivans' daughter Florence twice. Once, apparently at a public meeting, and another time later. Around that same time, on that same visit, he suggested that Anthony W. Ivans also should enter into the principal. He never did. But despite never entering into the principal, Anthony Ivans did recommend to his daughter Florence to take Taylor's proposal, but only if she wanted to. And apparently she didn't, because they didn't end up getting married, but he supported it.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Out of Anthony W. Ivans' journal for that trip, he writes, "We invited Apostle Taylor and family, Sister Morris and her daughter, and Sister Pert and Cannon to eat a wild turkey dinner with us." Heber Grant Ivans, his son, writes in reference to that, "This is reference to John W. Taylor, whose 3 wives, Nellie, Rhoda, and Roxy." I will amend that. It was not Nellie, it was Nettie. It was Nettie, Rhoda, and Roxy. "Were living in Juarez. Sister Morris was the mother of a woman known to us as Sister May. She was the wife of Frank Y. Taylor, brother to John W. Taylor. Sister Pert was the wife of John M. Cannon. She was known to the people of Juarez as Sister Jones. With the exception of John W. Taylor, none of these men appeared in public with his wife, as far as I can tell. And none of the women were ever known in the community by the name of her husband."
It's kind of sad still.
It is a little sad, but you see John W. Taylor and the wives of the counselors or the president of Granite Stake up in Utah traveling down in the colonies together, all together. Love it. March 1903. This is sad. This is another sad one. Apparently, in March 1903, John W. Taylor found out that Patriarch Alexander MacDonald was performing post-manifesto plural marriages. And he did not know that Joseph F. Smith had authorized him.
Oh.
So he got in trouble, and John W. Taylor got after Patriarch Alexander MacDonald. And sadly, in about 2 weeks after that confrontation, Patriarch MacDonald died.
Oh.
Supposedly of heartache or heartbreak, literally. So that's a sad one. And we know now that Brother MacDonald was commissioned by Joseph F. Smith. But again, these things have been compartmentalized, as you're saying, to the point where not everyone knows everything.
Yeah, and I see the wisdom in it, right? Because if somebody gets caught, nobody can spill the beans on everybody else.
Yep.
However, that sets up this sort of scenario, right? And again, it goes back to just stick with your principles to begin with. And a lot of this crap's unavoidable.
Yep. Oh my. All right. Here's a fun one. I didn't know this, and I would love to do more research on this to verify this, because I've never seen it anywhere else until I bought a book for this podcast to study these topics. I found out that Orson F. Whitney, I didn't even know that he had 2 wives. I thought he was a monogamist his whole life. But no, he had 2 wives publicly before he was an apostle. And he's still not an apostle at this point. He's still actually a bishop in Salt Lake City. But he marries his 3rd wife in Logan, Cache County, Utah. Probably it was Mariner Merrill that helped him out do that, because he was the guy up in Logan. I don't know that for a fact. But he had a 3rd wife. I'm like, let's go. Absolutely, let's go. Super happy. And he would after 10 days after he married this girl, he referred in his journal to himself as Muhammad, because Muslims are allowed to marry 3 or 4 wives. And
That's funny.
Anyway, so he was engaging in some code language apparently in his journal. I got that out of the Reed Smoot Hearings book that I bought. Let's see. Following that, the Alberta stake was divided because enough people have moved up to Canada to, okay, now we don't just have 1 stake, we have need of 2. So Matthias Cowley, John W. Taylor, and Anthony H. Lund. Reed Smoot and Joseph F. Smith all go up to Canada to divide the stake, and they make they divide the Alberta stake, and they make the Raymond, is it the Raymond stake? Taylor stake. They make it the Taylor stake.
Nice.
Named after John W. Taylor. And sometime during their visit, John W. Taylor or Matthias Cowley convinced Heber Allen, who was going to be the new president of the new Taylor stake, and the new Alberta stake president, Edward J. Wood, to marry plural wives.
Dude, yeah, they're going back to the whole thing of if you're going to be a leader, you have to be living this principle. So
Yeah.
let me ask you this question. At this time, both in Canada and Mexico, is this still predominantly just spots for polygamists?
I would say it would have to be, because what other reason would you have to leave Utah, your home, essentially? Or, because you're going down to a third world nation down in Mexico to live, but you have freedom. You have complete freedom at that point in time. And then up in Canada, you don't see the same freedom because the statistics show that most of those that moved up there that did have plural families only had about one wife in Canada, and they'd have other wives back in the States in hiding, and they'd have their one public wife, right? Or you were just there because you were related to people that were in that situation. Like, let's say I lived back in that day and my father decided, that he was going to take another wife up there, and I just happened to move up there with him, and I never did. So you had those families, right? And I'm starting my own family up there now, but so you had that, but it was definitely pretty much sponsored to allow the principle to survive.
The reason I bring this up is another thing that I hear that I don't agree with. History does not bear this out. This idea that plural marriage was just for the elites, right?
Very true. I hear that a lot too.
We're just for those men who were in the 12, maybe a few 70s. But here's the thing. If you're going to a polygamous colony, right, from what you said, that's exactly what we can say this is. If you have to go up to a polygamous colony and go, crap, we're too big, we got to split this stake. That's a lot of people entering that principle, right? Even if let's say only 60% were practicing plural marriage, that's a lot of polygamist families that require two different stakes now, right?
Yeah, I don't think the percentage was quite that high, but it was high enough. But maybe there's other motives for going there, but it does not change the fact the whole design of that program was to shelter people entering into the principle.
And my point is that there's enough going on that the idea of this was just for the elites. This was just for
who's ever heard of Heber Allen or Edward J. Wood? Well, some people have heard of Edward J. Wood. We're going to get to that,
right?
But they're local leadership. They're essentially not. I mean, maybe in some circles back down in Salt Lake, local leadership could probably be called elite, in some places, but out in the sticks and the boonies, probably not.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This was a far bigger program than just the 12 up top with a few 70s.
Yeah, and there's plenty of no clout people down in Mexico from the lists that I've seen too, and it's just the argument was attached to the elites of the church, but it wasn't exclusive to them.
No. I would expect the elites of the church to set the example on this.
Absolutely.
Right? If this is something that's supposed to be done, I just think that this is further proof that bears out this is not just for the boys up top. Right?
No. All right. So Edward J. Wood is made the stake president of the Alberta stake,
and enters into plural marriage. He would eventually become the first president of the Cardston, Alberta Temple, which was completed in 1923.
Nice.
And he was a practicing polygamist till his death in 1956. And
Again, think about this, right?
yeah,
That's a person ago.
that's a person. I know people born way earlier than
Yeah.
my grandmother was 16 years old in 1956.
My old man was born in 47. So
Sure.
at the same time, my dad is 9 years old. This dude is still a practicing polygamist.
Yeah. So he had one wife in Salt Lake City, and he lived with his wife in his first wife in Canada, and he would visit her. I don't know if it was more than twice a year, but I know he would go stay with his second wife during general conferences
Right.
in Salt Lake City.
And here's the thing. You will not be able to convince me that from 1902, you said this took place?
1903.
Okay, 1903 to 1956, people just went, oh crap, we forgot about that fundamentalist guy. We should X him. Right? I mean, so that's not a thing. That's not happening. They know full well in 1954 that dude who's the temple president up in Cardston, that dude's got 2 wives.
I don't know. That's a good question. How many people know at that point? I don't know who knows.
I don't think it's widespread, but you'll never convince me the higher ups don't know.
Yeah, no. This falls back under the area of where it's like the default will sanction that, even though it was after the manifesto, because it was just we can't not acknowledge it because it was so widespread.
Right.
David O. McKay, when President Wood died, David O. McKay told Hugh B. Brown, quote, "We have never had a greater president of a stake than Edward J. Wood."
Who said that?
David O. McKay.
That's interesting.
That is interesting.
There's more than one story that David O. McKay may have dabbled in the principle. And when I say dabbled, I mean dove right in.
Yeah, and I've heard those.
There's plenty of evidence. I talked to an old timer on this podcast once about Reuel Allred.
Right.
And he named the guy, right? So there was a special liaison to David O. McKay. And when someone would go ask David O. McKay about certain things, Adam, God, plural marriage, those things, he'd be like, I know someone you can talk to. He would say, I think his name was Gary Lee. Don't quote me. But Gary Lee would then go to Reuel and be like, hey, can you talk to this guy that David O. McKay wants you to talk to? And it was off and running. The part that's most fascinating to me about this whole thing is that we have it in our minds that there's this clean break, whether that's after the first manifesto or after the second manifesto, and it just does not exist. That clean break is not there. And from all the accounts I read, it's really not until about the 60s that the thing is so far gone that now there's a hard line drawn. There were certainly firebrands within the LDS Church, Mark E. Peterson being one of them, who wanted this thing wrapped up and done. But there's a lot of guys who are still very sympathetic to their fundamentalist brethren, so to speak.
No doubt about it. All right, September 11th, 1903, Joseph F. Smith decides that he wants to expand new polygamous marriages even further, and he authorizes John W. Taylor to commission Patriarch John A. Wolfe to perform those plural marriages, and particularly one for a man named Franklin D. Leavitt. Later, in 1911, when John Taylor was being questioned by the 12 for his membership, they asked him about marriages that Patriarch Wolfe did up in Canada, and he said to them, "I simply delivered him a message from someone in authority." So we have evidence that Joseph F. Smith had John W. Taylor appoint Patriarch Wolf. And Patriarch Wolf was a brother-in-law to Matthias Cowley.
Huh. Coincidence.
And coincidences all the way around. And they also asked Matthias Cowley during his trial, during that whole situation. And Matthias Cowley told them, all I know, I think, they asked him, how many marriages did Patriarch Wolf perform or whatever? He says, all I know, I think a Brother Levitt went to President Smith and asked him if it would be all right. And he referred him to Brother Taylor, who had charge of all things in Canada. So there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Let's see. Well, on a trip up to the Wyoming Bighorn Basin, Joseph F. Smith and John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley are hanging out up there, and Joseph F. Smith apparently, is there witnessing a very, very pro polygamy talk by John W. Taylor in public in the ward. Doesn't say anything about it. And afterwards, Matthias F. Cowley performed a marriage for the stake president.
Wow.
So they're traveling. They're doing the rounds to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's no doubt that that Joseph F. Smith is down with plural marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my goals for sure with this was to kind of remove all doubt for that.
Mission accomplished.
Thank you. We got a lot to cover still. What do you think about closing remarks until next time?
I'm good with that. I'm good with that.
You're-
Are you good with that, or do you want to keep going?
I don't know. I mean,
It's your call entirely.
we got plenty to go through later. So but I think we could
Wrap her up
Yeah.
here.
I think we could wrap her up for now for today. No need to kill either of us, but we got 3 years this time. This is really where the things got jam packed. This is really
Right.
where things started getting jam packed. I do want to go and spoil something actually, maybe to
Okay.
wrap it up. I gotta find it in my notes. Oh, wrong document. My bad. We haven't even gotten to the second document yet. What the heck?
It's because I keep derailing our conversation.
No, dude, it's so good. It's so good. I found an entry in Heber J Grant's journal. Since we talked about those patriarchal meetings, right?
Uh-huh.
That John W. Taylor's doing. I found an entry that I thought was so interesting. Two of them, I'll read two of them. In July of 1933.
Okay.
So apparently there had been a bishop named Archie Graham who had some experiences. I don't know what nature, something spiritual.
Okay.
And he was going around explaining these experiences. Church kind of gets a little wary when you start doing stuff like that.
Sure.
Right. So Heber J. Grant writes on July 21st, 1933, Joseph Fielding Smith called and expressed his regret at the speeches that Bishop Archie Graham is making, telling of his spirit leaving the body and so on. He thought that lectures of that kind ought not to be delivered to the people. We agreed with Brother Smith. He favored having the Genealogical Society publish a card to the effect that we do not approve of lectures of that kind without mentioning any names. So I guess Bishop Archie Graham was talking at the Genealogical Society. In any case, a few days later, Heber J. Grant writes, Bishop Archie Graham called and told of his manifestations, and we had a long talk with him. I explained about manifestations and the private meetings of the patriarchs in Davis County with Brother John W. Taylor, and how they thought they were more spiritually minded than others, and that these identical patriarchs got off their hooks and performed illegal plural marriages, etc. I assured him I thought it was a mistake for him to go around delivering his lectures. He thanked me and gave me to understand that he would discontinue doing this.
Wow.
What do you think?
So I want to say there's a time and a place for everything. right? And I never want to discount somebody's spiritual experience, but I get that there's a time and a place for them.
That's true.
However, this is a time when I feel like the church is getting weary of people having unsanctioned revelations, so
Sure.
to speak, because there really is kind of this idea of we got to consolidate things now. We can't be having any. This to me is the first time that we start seeing anything that would resemble correlation within the church. And I think if you're stepping outside those bounds of correlation, you can expect to be called on the carpet here.
Absolutely true. That is interesting to note the changing times, but I would say it's an interesting admission on Heber J. Grant's part to include that in his journal. And we're going to get more into this later during the next podcast episode or the next one or whenever we get to it. But he says private meetings of patriarchs in Davis County. So the three patriarchs that I know of who were patriarchs in the church who may have been in those meetings were John W. Woolley, Judson Tolman, and Israel Barlow Jr. And John Woolley was not patriarch yet, but Judson Tolman was patriarch in Davis County. He was found out in 1910 and excommunicated, sadly. We're going to get to that point eventually. But do you know who the church replaced Judson Tolman with?
Heber J. Grant?
John W. Woolley as patriarch.
Oh, awesome. Awesome.
So the church had one guy officiating as patriarch after John. I mean, because fast forward to 1910, John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley have been dropped from the Quorum of the 12.
Right.
And so things are getting even further underground right now. And John W. Taylor isn't able to be as public anymore as he was for years.
Right.
And so you have Judson Tolman carrying the torch. He marries Joseph Mustard to his third wife in 1907. And then they excommunicate him for it in 1910. Not Joseph Mustard, but Judson Tolman. And then they replace him with the guy who's going to do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Which I thought was awesome.
Okay. So at the time that Heber J. Grant makes this journal entry, is this before or after Grant was kind of smacked down, so to speak?
Very smacked down. No, he's president of the church, and the priesthood work is already going on at this point.
Heber J. Grant's already president of the church?
In 1933, in that journal entry that I read about where he's admitting that John W. Taylor was holding meetings. And he's telling the story to this guy named Archie Graham, right? Saying, look at this experience that happened. And John W. Taylor went off the rails. You're going to go off the rails if you keep sharing those experiences, because John W. Taylor was having these meetings with these patriarchs. And look at all the illegal plural marriages they did.
And see, that's so fascinating, because I do think that sets the precedent for how the church is going forward from that point, kind of make sure that they police people's spiritual activity outside of Sundays.
Yeah.
Right. People forget that before COVID, you weren't allowed to pass the sacrament in your home unless you had special permission from the bishop.
Sure.
Right. There was a time when people would have these cottage meetings, and the church finds out that this is a spot where ideas are passed around that the church doesn't necessarily want discussed anymore. And so now are they not only going to police you on Sundays when you go to church, but now they're entering a new phase, right? Which is we have to have greater correlation, and we have to make sure that there aren't meetings that are fostering some of these teachings that we now find problematic.
Yeah,
sure. In my opinion, that's probably a watershed moment at which at which this starts to become more of a thing, right? There's a reason Mormons don't have scripture study groups like the evangelicals do. And
Interesting point.
that's because I think the church does not want you going to 132 and then going to the manifesto going, guys, I think there's something wrong here. Right?
I'll play devil's advocate. The Harmston group
Yeah.
started from a study group.
Yep. If you let people alone, like I've always said, if you just hand somebody a copy of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants, you're going to get, and then drop them off in a desert island, or a deserted island, and say, okay, this is the religion you have to go by. It's going to look vastly different than what the LDS Church does today.
Interesting point.
And the brethren know that. They understand this, right? That you cannot just give them the scriptures and be like, okay, now go set it up, because it's going to look wildly different. And they don't want that. If you look at how the Quorum of the 12 was supposed to function, right? Those were supposed to be, traveling witnesses, right? Mm-hmm. And then there was a standing high council in Zion, right? We don't have that today.
No, we don't.
Right? And so, again, if you just hand people the scriptures and say, okay, now go do this, right? Put this into practice. It's going to look a lot different to the LDS Church. And that's why I believe, in my opinion, the church has went to extraordinary efforts to make sure everybody's correlated up, that everybody is on the program, right? I think that's what Come Follow Me was. I think that's what all the manuals were. It was all about not letting people read the scriptures and just be able to read the scriptures. Because if they do, they're going to see the obvious contradictions, and that's going to cause headaches in Salt Lake City.
No, a lot of people love they'd call it beauty in correlation. Anywhere you can go in the world, the church is going to be the same. And I get that. I like order too, by the way. And growing up in the church, yeah, I kind of expect some of that. And so fundamentalism sometimes to me is a bit more.
Oh, it's the Wild West of Mormonism.
It's more than I like it to be sometimes. But That being said, even in the church, though, I lived all over the map, and I've seen interesting things that are different from one place to another, and you can't control it all.
No, you can try.
No, you can try. In any case, I'm not the biggest fan of correlation. It got rid of some of my favorite teachings, but I really think there's some rock solid evidence there from Heber J. Grant and other places that we'll see that really those patriarchal meetings that John W. Taylor had was a catalyst for the work being done in our day.
I think we'll look back later in these conversations and see that it was that move by John W. Taylor that essentially set the ball rolling into what would become fundamentalism.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, awesome. What are we going to talk about next time? Where are we going?
Read Smoot hearings.
Woo! I like that. All right. We'll look forward to that. Thanks, man.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Bye, everybody.